Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Beyond the Present podcast. My name is Daniel Mulligan. I'm joined here live by Poujix from Toronto, Canada. Hey there, my man. How's it going?
Life's great. How are you?
Well, we're doing pretty fine here, and Emmy is back for yet another great show. Emmy, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
We are doing all wonderful and terrific. And guess what, guys? Today, our topic, once we first heard about it, I literally was baffled. Like, what the heck? I mean, I've never heard such a terminology. And Poujix, what was that term again?
Oh, the superbug.
Superbug.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, and that's not the bugs that you think like in computer science or whatever. This is superbug. It's a cool terminology. And guess what? Emmy knows a lot about it. So, Emmy, please tell us right off the bat, what is a superbug?
So a superbug, so when we're talking about those are, I guess, just like a general term for microorganisms that are resistant to any kind of antimicrobials or anything that, was meant to kill them. And so to look at superbugs or microorganisms, that could be anything. Like most people think of bacteria, but that can also include fungus, viruses, parasites. And so this is actually becoming like a really big global concern for everyone, that the appearance of these superbugs is going to be a big health risk for a lot of people.
Interesting. So it's a health risk. Is it just for animals or for humans or both?
So it's for basically everybody. So a lot of the, especially with bacteria, we find that a lot of them are shared between animals and us. So especially in the food industry, so like cows, chickens, pigs, a lot of those things can be shared, passed back and forth between people and animals. So it's definitely not just a risk for like human health, but like animal health and all that. So it's all interconnected. It's a really big issue. Interesting.
And Beyond the Present podcast, we are so much focused on the concept of futurism and what happens in the future. So, do you think this issue of superbugs is going to be a serious problem in the future? Is it going to be the new Ebola or something?
So So, everyone's always scared about like things like Ebola and stuff, but like this is like as big of a threat that something simple like Staphylococcus or E. coli could be killing people again. This is predicted to be like one of the three greatest threats to global health. This is like predicted by the World Health Organization. So within the next they're expecting that we may have like an era within this century where antibiotics might not be useful anymore.
Oh my goodness! So, and listen, was it like a century or a decade?
Like this is within, I guess, the 21st century.
Oh my goodness! Go ahead, Poujix.
So out of curiosity, what are the other two big ones?
I think one of them is Donald Trump. One of them is isn't that one of them is Donald Trump, right?
Donald Trump, like nuclear fallout, like anything like that, or famine and like global warming.
Oh my goodness! So right now we are talking about a serious health problem that might make antibiotics useless in the future. That's a serious issue. But with that being said, do we currently have these super bugs basically all around the world, or we're going to experience some of these things in the future?
So we're definitely seeing that already. Some of the biggest things I think most people might have heard before is like MRSA or VRE. So those are names. So MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and then VRE is vancomycin-resistant enterococci. And basically, those methicillin-resistant and vancomycin-resistant is a really big issue because those are technically like the biggest antibiotics we have. Like those are like the hard hitters. And so if we're already having bacteria that are resistant to those, it's kind of like there's not much else we can really do to tackle them. Like there's nothing else that's really effective. So we're already seeing that, and that these kind of infections are becoming more and more common, especially in hospitals. If you have someone that's sick there, and then every other person that comes in, that you're not going to a hospital because you're in good health. So they're more susceptible to these kind of infections, and then once they get them, it's really hard to treat them.
One question, are superbugs just bacteria, or we also have viruses that could be called superbugs?
We could technically have viruses as well. So not that we're seeing those as quickly, and it's mostly because the way that we treat viruses, we don't have many like antivirals, but you see things, we can see it with vaccines. So with people who aren't vaccinated, we have like viruses I guess basically, proliferating within them, they're able to mutate. So then they start to get more and more virulent. And, that's another way that you could get it. But we see it more so with microorganisms that are alive, like bacteria, just because they are alive and they are able to multiply at a much faster rate. So we are seeing the resistance much quicker than we would say with like parasites or viruses.
Wow. I'm going to sound like an idiot asking this question because I had no idea. What exactly is the difference between like a bacteria as well as a virus? I mean, I know we have this thing called good bacteria that are necessary, and like our body is riddled and filled with bacteria basically. But generally, like people say, like you have this disease because of bacteria, and you have this one because of viruses. So as a vet who has a lot of experience in this field, what is the difference between somebody getting sick by bacteria versus somebody getting sick by viruses?
So I guess first to look at viruses, is basically viruses aren't something that you would normally not as commonly find within a human host or any kind of host for that matter. They absolutely need a host in order to replicate. So on their own, they can't reproduce, whereas like bacteria and other things, for the most part, can live outside of a host. Viruses are really just DNA and protein. That's all there is to them. And so they just use that and they hijack either a human or an animal's body to replicate. Mm-hmm. Whereas bacteria, they are living in the sense, like they have more components to them and they are able to reproduce on their own. But it's when they also kind of take advantage of the host and replicate for their own self, and that's where they start to get like symptoms of diseases. I guess too, I should probably backtrack. When we're looking at bacteria, so like you had mentioned, we do have healthy bacteria that are a part of us.
That's
so
right.
Those are more like ones work together. Then there's ones that kind of fall in a gray area, which I would call opportunistic. So these are ones that you can actually find like living on a host and living like without causing disease. So one of the ones I mentioned earlier, Staphylococcus. So that's something that we can usually find on the skin of people and animals. But like, let's say we have an open wound. One of the common things we find in hospitals is burn victims. So obviously like there's trauma to the skin. If they're introduced to that, they can cause really bad infections there. So again, it's not that they always cause disease, but given the right settings, they can. So opportunistic. And then there's ones which is virulent or pathogenic. So those are the ones, once they're introduced to a body, that's when they kind of don't work together in harmony with the host, and they're more for their benefit. And that's where you get like diseases and symptoms because of the things that they're wrecking it. Like they're not working in harmony with your body. So that causes stress and immune response, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting. That's a good one. Let me just first go to Poujix here. Poujix, how health conscious are you in general? I mean, like, do you like get sick often with these, viruses and bacteria or something?
Well, I hope not the super ones.
We're not going to talk about those in a moment, like how we can actually prepare ourselves for them. But like, think of the normal bugs, the typical Coolio bugs, not the super ones. So, like, are you generally health conscious? And do you think you get sick a lot because of these things, bacteria or virus? And if so, to which your body is more susceptible, basically, in terms of getting sick?
Right. Well, I don't. Yes, I am health conscious. I do tend to take care of myself because I generally, probably like everybody else, I don't like to get sick. I don't know if I've never met that person who wants to get sick.
Oh, trust me, I know a lot of people who love. You know what? I know some people who love to get sick. You know why?
Why?
Because of the attention, dude. I mean, these guys love the attention of their family members or whatever. They adore that stuff, and they just want to get sick.
Yeah, now that you mention it, there is actually another group, and that's when the exam is approaching and you're not prepared.
That's right. Getting all those days off, right? So true. So true.
Well, but I don't. So one of the things that is, I think, in recent years was more obvious to me is that because I am more in public and I'm constantly way more than I don't know, 5-6 years ago. I'm reliant on public transport. I'm in public much more. I'm in contact with younger students who I teach, for example, and all that. I see that I get minor sicknesses more often than I used to. That is true. I mean, again, all of these reasons that I gave are just my hypotheses. It's not scientifically proven that that's the reason because I'm getting more sick.
You little naughty boys, because I'm getting sick all the time, you friggin' students. That's possible.
Nothing just them. It's like a bunch of things that have increased in my life in the past couple of years or so that I think Yeah, but overall, yes, I am very health conscious,
And one
I
question,
also,
I'm not sure if you've gone to doctors when you got sick. Like most of your diseases, are they caused by like viruses or like by bacteria?
yeah, that is a good question. Actually, that's a good question for Em, I guess.
Have you ever gotten any, let's say, diagnostics for this matter?
For myself?
Yes, to get the, for example, the doctor says like,
yeah.
oh yeah, you guys got serious problems because of bacteria.
Unfortunately, for better or for worse, I don't really know, but I tend to not go to doctors in the first instances of any symptoms.
Wow.
In a hope that it just passes away.
Dude, when was the last time that you went to a doctor? I'm actually curious.
It was last winter, actually, February.
Holy moly, the last winter. Oh my gosh.
Well,
wow.
I'm talking about, I'm not considering dentists or anything like that. It's just like
you probably haven't got any diagnosis, buddy. I got it. So let's move on to Emmy. Emmy in general.
I do have.
That's right. That's right. Emmy in general, do the majority of the diseases, basically, do they come because of viruses or bacteria in general?
So I guess that also depends on like the area, like the region you're in and the time of the year too. So like you would say like right now, North America in the winter time, when it starts to get cold, we do see like more viral diseases, like so like your common cold or your flus. But you can also see, I guess around this time too, you can see more like strep throat, which is bacteria. So it depends very much. But I guess I would say that because bacteria is much more common and like much more numerous than for viruses, you probably have much more of a chance of getting certain bacterial infections. Actually, I'm just trying to and I guess back to your earlier note, you were asking about like how much of an issue this is. I was just checking the CDC, doing some like live fact checking. But so within the U.S., 2 million people get antibiotic resistant infections, and then 23,000 people die from them.
Oh my! In which year was it? In this year?
This is most recent. I think this is 2017.
Oh my goodness! Wow, that's a serious issue, obviously. And since you talked about the superbugs, and before I go any further to talk about how we can prevent this from happening, you mentioned earlier about developing resistance to antibiotics. Basically, I mean, what exactly is that? I mean, I heard one of my friends told me not to take a lot of antibiotics because he said like if you take a lot of it, at some point your body will somehow develop a resistance to it. Is that true? Like the more let's say antibiotics we take, the worse it gets, or it's actually pretty okay from your perspective?
I think one of the common misconceptions with antibiotic resistance. So antibiotic resistance is kind of different than antimicrobial because antimicrobial is very broad spectrum. But antibiotics is specifically for bacteria and fungus. So when you take antibiotics, it's not that your body itself is getting resistant to it; it's the bacteria that you're trying to target is what becomes more resistant. So because they're living, they can evolve. They have genetics and they can get mutations. And part of the reason is like where this resistance comes from is they develop mechanisms to either avoid one of the common things is called they have pumps. So bacteria, if you think of it as it has like a membrane inside is like the cell. They have these pumps lined in their membrane so that if they take in a drug, instead of letting the drug, do damage and destroy the cell, it's able to pump it back out so it's basically ineffective. It can recognize what these antibiotics look like, and then it can say, oh, nope, not dealing with that. So we can either get rid of it, break it down. So, and because bacteria, they're kind of a little promiscuous, so they can share these genetics with other bacteria. So then more of them get this resistance over time. So if you're not able to kill these bugs off, then they're able to either grow on, pass it on. So that's why I think bacteria is kind of the major concern when you think about antimicrobial resistance.
That's right.
Just because of how adaptive they've become.
That makes sense. Very well. So before I move any further, Poujix, do you have any question from Emmy before I talk about how to actually deal with these superbugs?
Yeah, I actually do have a question, but that is in the context of how you deal with superbugs.
Fantastic.
So you go on and all that.
That's right, because that's the real issue. So, Emmy, how serious is the problem of superbugs? And if you were to portray a future right now, not of course by the end of the century, but let's say like in the next 10, 20 years, do you really think like we are going to being somehow in a serious condition where we have to just escape from this disease and societies will be collapsed? Is that a serious problem as we see like in some of these Hollywood movies, or it's not that of a dire situation?
I would say it's maybe not within maybe not within the next decade, but definitely, like, I guess it's hard to say, like, maybe speaking from like where we are in a like North America in a more developed nature, we may be okay just because of how our healthcare is set up. But in other regions, I think we would definitely be seeing much more like almost like apocalyptic type threats. Like
apocalyptic.
So the biggest issue we see here is that with antibiotics, most of the ones that so the original one, like if we remember, like, 1928 or so, like penicillin was discovered and, then became like a drug, which was the first antibiotic. They're originally found from other microbes. So this is something that we did like really make, but it's really hard to find these drugs naturally. So most of the ones that we have on the market now are just based off ones that we've already discovered. So it's really just like changing it a little like chemically and trying to make it a little different. So because we're not finding any more drugs, it's basically once these drugs are useless, then that's basically it. Like we haven't really been having the same
one
kind
question,
of
Em. I mean, isn't medicine supposed to somehow be always developing and get better all the time? I mean, why is it in a world where we're trying to solve a lot of problems? Why is it that we cannot find a solution?
Lying here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So my question is lying here exactly what Dan is talking about, and that question is basically this. So my understanding is that there is not much incentive in the pharmaceutical companies, or basically in the private sector, to go for the very expensive next generation of antibiotics at this point.
Yes.
And then that is the discussion that people are saying that, okay, this has to become a public government kind of issue, which is not turning to be apparently. Can you do you have any ideas on that? Is that correct? Or
yeah, actually, pharmaceuticals they don't make a lot of money from antibiotics. Especially because it's a drug that's really only supposed to be taken for a short amount of time, and because it's almost like an arms race of trying to putting all this money into making a new synthetic one that isn't going to be that effective. You've seen a real big decrease in the amount of funding that goes towards antibiotic production. And yeah, even looking into discovering new antibiotic, naturally occurring ones is almost impossible just because of how microbiology is and how sneaky they are, how hard it is to actually isolate one compound from one type of bug. It's not something that pharmaceuticals are really incentivized to look into.
One question regarding these incentives. Are you saying that this issue is caused because it's not financially feasible to actually go and create these drugs, or because these companies themselves, they want to intentionally create this hazard?
I definitely think that they weren't intentionally trying to make this hazard, but I think that I guess from one factor of it is probably not enough funding going in from the pharmaceutical perspective, but I would say more of the challenge itself is just the biology of finding these drugs naturally and being able to actually market them. Mm-hmm. I think since the 70s, I'm maybe not exactly sure on the timeline, but the most recent antibiotic that's been found, since that whole antibiotic discovery phase from the 1920s has been 2016, where they found the actual first discovery of a major antibiotic has been. So there's really not a lot that's been not a lot moving forward, just because it's so hard to actually do this. And that's a whole microbiology lesson to go over. But wow. I wouldn't say it's not purely because it's, they're trying to make superbugs. It's just it's really, really hard to do it.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the thing that I hear being said around, whether that's true or not, and that is not intentionally creating these superbugs, but the fact that, as you mentioned, the antibiotics are very short period of time, and as you mentioned, there's so many challenges to actually developing these next generation of antibiotics. The research, the money that needs to go into it is so massive that it doesn't make any financial sense for a pharmaceutical company that is above everything else probably trying to sustain itself financially. It wouldn't make any sense to do it. So again, there was an argument that this should fall into the public sector, and the public sector should pick this up, because it will become a national and eventually worldwide crisis. But that is not particularly happening either, apparently.
No, and I think that's maybe more of a reactive kind of action than a proactive one. So until it becomes a big issue, I don't know if the pressure is really on of how serious this could actually become.
Right.
So you mentioned about this. We should right now
Fair enough.
portray an image of future, like how will this affect society? So we are saying like people who are sick everywhere and like it's quite contagious. Because I'm not sure if bacteria are very contagious. Are they?
Yeah, they can be. I guess it's hard. It's hard to think about, but you think of how much they say wash your hands after going to the bathroom, or not coughing or sneezing into your hands, or if you do clean your hands after, don't touch other surfaces. It's really that easy and simple. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the biggest areas that we see these resistant bacteria, we see the highest rates of infections tend to be in hospitals, and that's because of contamination from other people, and then not being able to fully get rid of these resistant bacteria. And so then when you have more people come in, then they get infected by the same bacteria that they haven't gotten rid of before. So
wow, serious problem, obviously. So now that we've depicted a future in which we have to be concerned about superbugs, let us now talk about first finding a solution to actually get rid of them in the future. Because if you remember, we once talked about the whole anti-vaxxer syndrome and how people somehow don't want to get vaccinated or something. Could there at any point we be able to create vaccines against superbugs?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely something, we already do have vaccines that are targeted towards bacteria. But I would say that with those, it tends to be much more tricky to get an effective one. So I feel like that would be an alternative to having resistance to these bacteria than having to deal with treatment like antibiotics. So probably would be more looking into that. And then that is something that I think could be, at least more incentivized than antibiotics, just because of but even then, vaccines is not a very profitable market. It's really
That's so true. You got to keep the patients coming. Oh my goodness. Never thought about the whole medical industry as like a business, man. Literally, these guys need more patients. That's just so, think about the pharmaceuticals, man. These guys are just ruining it.
Look, in their defense, though, I'm not in love with them, but in their defense, ultimately they're doing so much good at the same time, and there are some problems that are not designed for the private sector, and they're designed for the public sector. There is a reason we have a public sector, because there are some problems that need to be funded on a very massive scale.
Well, you're right, but let's be honest right now, because right now you two guys are in Canada, right? I heard Canada has one of the best healthcare systems in the world, I heard. Very high quality. Right. But how about places like right now, Trump, think of Trump, right? He actually wanted to somehow get rid of the Obamacare, basically, and wanted to make basically healthcare private. And in many other countries, we do not have necessarily a very strong healthcare system. So how about those countries where they might not be able to benefit from a very extensive and reliable healthcare system?
Yeah, but then in those countries, you wouldn't have a very reliable pharmaceutical company, and at least flourishing one either. So that's the reason that there's a whole discussion about healthcare in America, and finally people are basically coming to this idea that okay, this makes a little bit of sense, so let's move one step towards it, not all the way like Obamacare or something or whatever. So yeah, people are warming up to the idea because of the reasons that you're mentioning, but obviously there are so many political obstacles here.
Interesting. And speaking of superbugs, Emmy, how do you think, in terms of the costs, the final costs of prevention or treatment, do you think it's going to be a very expensive procedure for the patients in the future, or they really will need the help of, let's say, health insurance companies to somehow deal with the problem?
Oh, already we're seeing just alone with the hospitalizations, not even taking into account deaths. This is billions of dollars in healthcare costs, right? Wow. Which is not even just on the individuals, but on the countries themselves. And you think of how many people are sick, and so not many people are working. It'll all stack up too. And when you look into places where there's going to be more changes, drastic changes in climate, because of climate change, so more natural disasters flooding and anything that leads people to be more susceptible. So all these things kind of tie in together.
Wow. We are portraying a huge apocalypse for humanity here. That's amazing. I just can't believe it. But overall, now that you mentioned all of these things, let us first talk about it. What's that?
Yeah. So, yes, these are all the problems that are going to happen if we stay passive. It's not like there are no solutions. We always had problems. We had famine in the past. We had a lot of other problems that we overcame, but we did something about them.
Exactly.
And we need to do stuff about that.
Precisely.
And one of the things that are actually very perplexing, these issues, like, I mean, somewhat climate change, I suppose, but technological disruptions or superbugs or none of these issues ever come up in political debates for elections, which is actually perplexing because these are the most important problems.
Well, because let's be honest, in our political campaigns, we don't talk about the severity of the issue and how, for example, things like superbugs. I mean, you and I both, we've never heard about things like superbugs and how they can actually cause a havoc.
A lot of people are not informed. True. No, that's true. A lot of people are not informed either. That's also true. Hence the podcast, I suppose.
Exactly.
But at the same time, there is also the short attention span of political systems, which is you're trying to be elected for 4 years, in some cases 2 years or thereabouts, and it doesn't make sense to talk about problems that are 10, 20, 30, 50 years away, although you would need a lot of incentives, like a Manhattan Project level incentive to basically deal with these sort of problems like climate change, like superbugs.
Speaking of dealing with the problems, let's not talk about this issue. So, you now scared us as well as our listeners. We are now we are freaking scared. So what is the way out? What can we do? First of all, to prevent it from happening, if we can, and more importantly, how to deal with it once it occurs.
So I guess the biggest thing is the preventative care, and that's really I guess from what you can do on an individual level is not being more hygienic, like washing your hands. It sounds silly, but washing your hands properly, or using hand sanitizer. But debates on that. Even things like. There used to be a trend of people feeling sick. They just wanted antibiotics. I think doctors are having much more pressure of, not just handing out antibiotics willy-nilly, making sure it's actually a bacterial infection, not a viral one, because antibiotics wouldn't help for that. So you're just taking them for nothing. Making sure to finish the course of antibiotics. So part of that is if you are sick and you are prescribed antibiotics, if you don't finish the dose, then you might not kill all of the bacteria that are there, and so then those ones become resistant, and then they have a whole new population. So you're just adding to the resistance. Even things like not flushing the antibiotics down the toilet, getting that into the water system, having them leak into the environment, that's a big issue. So then you get more environmental resistant bacteria. Wow. Just little efforts that you can make, also too, if your family members, anything like that kind of communication with them, making sure that they're aware, follow doctor's instructions, don't push for it if you don't need it.
That's very nice. And by the way, you mentioned finishing and flushing, and I just got a naughty thought right in my head right now. What about STDs? I mean, is there any link between STDs and superbugs?
Oh yeah, there is. I think there is a super gonorrhea. So that's really drug resistant. And so, I guess even then when it comes to having safe protective sex, getting tested regularly, making sure you don't spread it to numerous partners. Interesting.
Very well. So we do not need to take any extra measures when it comes to, for example, our sex life in terms of being more basically aware of this matter. So just using condom, are these things going to be sufficient, or we have to take extra measures as well?
I think condoms is probably the best way to do it, just because there is that actual physical barrier of not having it there. Getting tested between multiple partners, also just I think people just being more comfortable having those discussions. There's some people that are embarrassed to talk about it, and there's kind of a stigma against it, but it's just being any part, you wouldn't be ashamed, I guess you think of it oh, sorry, I gave you the cold, oh, sorry, I gave you gonorrhea, my bad. Oh.
And by the way, since we might not know about the details here, because we're just talking about, of course, you mentioned using basically condoms, but how about other things? How about, getting somehow some sort of STDs where by other means, let's say foreplays, oral sex, or other things? What else can we do in those regards from your perspective? Are those also kind of dangerous? Or the biggest problem is the intercourse?
I would say I think intercourse would be the biggest one. And then again, I guess too, because of actually, I guess there is such thing as oral STIs as well. So anything where, there's exposure to a mucosal membrane. So, either mouth, anything like that. Whereas, or if you had a wound on your hand, like maybe not use those fingers, etc.
Interesting. So lesson number one, you got a wound on your hand, don't use those fingers. Give it in your goddamn pocket. That's rule number one. Rule number two, use condoms. Rule number three, if you want to go for the whole thing, just say, hey, honey, you got a superbug or what? I'm going to be very pissed if you do. And then this will help you a lot to somehow save your life in the near future. But ultimately, what you're really suggesting now is for us to be more hygienic, in our lives in all aspects. That's pretty much what you're saying.
Especially with bacterial infections, I think it's at least like what the average person can do for sure. Like you think of like what the times were before penicillin was introduced, and infectious diseases was like the leading cause of death, and that improved over time as well with hygiene. But I think we've almost become too reliant on antibiotics, being like, oh, if I get sick, like I can do this. But seeing as that might not be an option for much longer, it's kind of having to think like, okay, I can't really just fall back on this. Like, what else can I do to reduce my chances of getting sick?
Interesting. Poujix, you got any question before I go for the last question?
No. Go
So
ahead.
here's the last one. From your perspective, if, let's say, we've done everything, we tried all these measures, precautionary measures, and we tried our very best, boom, we got the goddamn superbug in our body. So is it like all the hopes are gone? Like, is it too late now, or we can do something about it?
So there's still, like, as of right now, we still have things to deal with it. Like, like I said before, out of 2 million hospitalizations, there was 23,000 deaths. So right now we still are able to manage it, and we still are able to. But I guess if we came to a point where antibiotics are no longer viable, like we might be seeing more increases of deaths. But I think there also is research looking into other forms of drug, like antimicrobials. So I know there's like other kind of products, like antimicrobial peptides is starting to be like the new hope, or like the new penicillin, which is something that's similar to antibiotics, but it's more of like a small protein that also interferes with bacteria and other kinds of like microorganisms. Things like I know a lot of silver products, like any kind of compounds, like more inorganic compounds. They're looking at potential things to help with that. Antibiotics were like a more organic source, or at least originally. So there is hopes, but again, it's like the research is slow. There's not a lot going into it. And then, even then looking into drug trials takes, a number of years to actually get something approved. So you don't want to really rely on that just yet, but there is potential for something else in the future.
That is wonderful. Such a great piece of information for us, because I personally had no idea that these things actually existed, like superbugs. That's just incredible. So now we're reaching the end of the show. Let's try to actually wrap up the whole conversation and reach a final conclusion. So Poujix, you heard it, I heard it, and yes, we are both scared shitless. So from your perspective, what is now your final conclusion? What are your own steps? And let's just hear your final thought about this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are a little bit more broader than the superbugs themselves, and that is, I mentioned, we clearly have a political problem, and that is not to the United States, that is not to Canada, worldwide. We are having such a short span of attention, and most of our most important issues and most catastrophic issues are actually long-term issues rather than short-term.
Exactly.
So we need to start paying attention to those stuff as well. In our decision making, in whether we want to elect this person into office or the other or whatever. So these issues need to be considered voting for a person, and superbugs are obviously one of them. And you're right, we're terrified. That's a good thing to be terrified, not terrified to the extent that you're like, okay,
paralyzed or something.
We're going to die by superbugs, or if that's not going to happen, the climate change, or if not that, artificial intelligence, if not that, an asteroid will come hit me. So I don't want to create that vision that it's a very dystopian situation. We have no hope, so what's the point of living? These are problems. They have solutions. We just have to dedicate time and effort to them.
Fantastic. So, Em, after all of your great thoughts, what is now your conclusion about this discussion?
Yeah, I know. I felt that. I was like, I guess because of my background, I definitely had a lot more exposure to this kind of topic, even like a few years ago while I was still in my undergrad studying. So I'm kind of like desensitized to like, I'm like, always in the back, yeah, they're going to kill us all. Like, I get it. But I guess like even having this talk today, I kind of realized that like how much this idea is not like a general public kind of issue. Like it's not something that more people are aware about. So I think, part of like getting to Poujix's suggestion of like getting more involved at like a global, like national level, like getting governments and having politicians is having, the public be aware that this is an issue that they should be concerned about. So, getting that info out there, like, hey, do you even like, what are the superbugs? Like, why, wash your damn hands? Like getting that information out there and making sure people are more aware of it, I think is, a big step in getting the right politicians who are going to actually address these issues and looking at these long-term goals down the road. I think that's really like the biggest first step that we can do in trying to deal with this.
Such a wonderful discussion. And I want to thank you so much, Emmy, for your great thoughts. It was, of course, a little bit at first intimidating, but generally I think we need these types of fear because it allows us to think somehow twice about a lot of our decisions, from voting to choosing people in basically the, as presidents or as politicians, more importantly about our personal life and what we do in terms of our level of hygiene and many other factors. So it was really, I think it was a tough call, but generally speaking, I personally would like to make a lot of changes in my life from now on, basically, for the fact that superbugs can pose a serious threat to not only us, but of course the future generation as well. So thank you very much for both of you, especially you, Emmy, for your great thoughts and ideas. Truly appreciate it.
For sure. No, thanks for having me.
Definitely. And of course, Poujix, as always, you're the man behind the show and behind everything. So I truly appreciate your effort as well.
Thank you.
And thank you, all of you guys, for listening to our podcast every week and leaving your comments. So if you have any further ideas on how we can actually develop the show and somehow create new topics and ideas, so please let us know on our website as well as on iTunes. And of course, while you're at it, why don't you try to leave a ranking? We prefer 5 stars, obviously, and that'll help us to reach a wider audience. This is all the time we have for. My name is Daniel Mulligan, and this was Beyond the Present Podcast. Thank you very much.